Before this video begins, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my channel members who you can see on screen now. Become a member by hitting the join button and get your name here among other awards today. Hello there and welcome back to some more Forza Top Gear laps. Today we are taking a look at some more retro hot hatches. We begin with perhaps the definitive retro hot hatch, the 1984 Volkswagen Golf aka Rabbit GTI, 90 horsepower, 105 foot-pound torque, 2,100 pounds of weight. This is the least powerful car here today. Of course, the Volkswagen Golf GTI is essentially credited as the hot hatch that would kick off the entire hot hatch revolution that we saw during the 80s. There were cars before this, such as the Vauxhall Chevette GSI, and of course the Sunbeam Lotus, but that never really caught on. This was sort of the first mainstream car to catch on, which is interesting because Volkswagen thought it would be an entire complete flop. Again, this particular version is the American version, the Rabbit GTI, but I'm calling it the Golf GTI just because I'm English and that's what we know this as, and they're basically the same car, aside from the fact that Rabbit has square lights and the Golf has circular ones. As far as it goes to drive, it is a relatively decent car to drive. It's not quite as fun as it used to be. This used to be a great car to throw around the course. It isn't quite that anymore. It has lost a little bit of its sparkle. The diff also doesn't help. There is a slight bit of one tyre fire that goes on within this vehicle. It's quite common for these older front-wheel drive cars to suffer from that, and even some rear-wheel drive older cars can suffer from that as well. But it is something you have to bear in mind. That being said, upgrade the differential, put a roll cage in it and tune it up a little bit, and these make for fantastically fun little race cars. A field of sort of small super minis from about the 80s definitely makes for some interesting racing, but if I was to do that, I would take our next car. This is the 1984 Honda Civic CRX Mugen, 120 horsepower, 92 foot-pound torque, 1,819 pounds of weight. This is the least torquey car here today. It is also the lightest by quite some margin as well. The only car here today to weigh under 2,000 pounds. Of course, this is a first-generation CRX Civic. This was back when Civic and CRX were bundled into one little thing. Eventually, CRX would go on to become its own nameplate, although it would still be related to the Civic in some way. The CRX being a two-door coupe that Honda would launch, and it would sort of go from the 80s and into the early 90s when it would eventually be discontinued as these cars didn't really make a whole lot of sense. It sort of got replaced by the Integra later on. As far as this one goes to drive, it's very simple. This is a fantastic handling car. It really is an absolutely incredible piece of machinery to chuck around. Maybe my favourite driving car here today, certainly the one that surprised me the most. I know old Hondas are good handling cars, don't get me wrong, but I was expecting the differential to be a little bit poor. I was expecting the lack of straight line speed to really hurt this car. It really doesn't. The only real complaint I can have about this car is the gearbox is a little bit too long. In my mind, it does make sort of getting the max out of this engine, considering it makes so little torque, a little bit of an issue when you're sort of climbing the gears, especially launching at first. But other than that, it is a very solid car indeed. Next up, we have the 1988 Volkswagen Scirocco 16 valve, 123 horsepower, 120 foot-pound torque, 2,365 pounds of weight. I guess you could see this as a competitor to the CRX. The Scirocco, much like the CRX, is essentially a Golf, which has been stretched out slightly and then called a coupe. I'm not sure if it's a two-door or three-door, I can't quite remember off the top of my head. The Scirocco would run basically throughout the 80s. It would eventually get discontinued in the early 90s and then bought back as another Golf derivative in 2009. It would come back, and then eventually it would be killed off not too long ago, actually, although it used Mark V Golf internals, so that kind of explains why that one hit the wayside. This particular Scirocco, the 88 Scirocco, I think is a great looking car, especially in the silver. I don't know why I really like it, but there's just something about the sort of boxy style this Scirocco has. I'm a huge fan of it, which is weird because I'm not usually a fan of sort of the 80s Volkswagen styling in general. As far as it goes to drive though, it is anything but good. Unfortunately, this thing does suffer from a really poor differential. It will basically spin one wheel as soon as you let it. It also has a very weird the front end feels very, very heavy. Now, this is of course common, these are front wheel drive cars, there's a lot of bias towards the front, but the Scirocco especially, it feels like the front end pushes, even when you're braking, and like going through a corner, the front end still pushes the car along. It's very strange indeed. Next up, we have our first four-wheel drive car of the day, the 1992 Ford Escort RS Cosworth, 224 horsepower, 224 foot-pound torque, 2,811 pounds of weight. Of course, this is the Escort RS Cosworth Escort, but not quite an Escort because it was more a Sierra underneath the skin, made as essentially a homologation special for the rally courses. The Cosworth Rally Escort would race from 1992 to 1998, where it would then later be replaced by the Focus WRC. The Escort RS Cosworth would discontinue production, I believe it was 96 or 97. They stopped making this, and eventually Fast Focuses would come along to replace the Escort Cosworth, although none of them had all-wheel drive, and the Escort itself would die off in the year 2000. Although, personally, I'm a huge fan of these late model Escorts. I think they look really excellent. I kind of like the RS Cosworth for its silliness, the whale tail spoiler. I prefer the later ones with the sort of more blobby styling at the front for some reason, but that's sort of a personal preference. As far as it goes to drive, it is a very good car to drive. Little bit of understeer, as you'd expect. It drives sort of similar to a lot of these 90s rally cars. Think Subarus, think Mitsubishi, think the Lancia Delta Integrale. They all handle relatively similar, and this is no exception. Maybe a little bit more understeer than you get from a Subaru or a Mitsubishi, but still a decent car nonetheless. Next up, we have the 1993 Renault Clio Williams, 142 horsepower, 129 foot-pound torque, 2,233 pounds of weight. Picking up where the old Renault 5 GT left off, the Clio Williams is a little bit of a misnomer. Of course, the Williams F1 team never actually breathed on this car. I believe it was all done in-house, and it boils down to the relative simple philosophy of these older hot hatches. You take a small car and you put a big engine in it. In this case, it is a 2-litre naturally aspirated unit, I believe, out of Renault Fuego, Espace, Laguna, a bunch of those sort of cars. That's why the power figures aren't too significant. 142 horsepower isn't that impressive from a 2-litre, but when you say, yes, you got 142 horsepower in a Clio, that is more impressive. Interestingly, these 2-litre hot hatch naturally aspirated Clios would continue all the way to 2013, when Renault finally decided to discover what a turbocharger was. But yeah, it's sort of, I guess, kind of cool little thing that you can get these naturally aspirated hot hatches as late as 2012. As far as it goes to drive, well, it's pretty bad. It has a horrific diff, there's a lot of understeer. Essentially what it boils down to is, I think, because of the engine, because it's just a normal saloon family car engine, it weighs too much for the front end of this car and it can't quite put up with it. Yeah, an appalling handling car, certainly not one I would find myself recommending, it has to be said. Next up, we have the 2003 Volkswagen Golf R32, 241 horsepower, 236 foot-pound torque, 3,256 pounds of weight. This is the heaviest car here today, the Golf R32. Of course, this is what happens when you take a Mark IV Golf, which is a very heavy car, try to put a GTI badge on it, and then everyone laughs at you for the fact that it has no performance whatsoever. Yeah, the Mark IV GTI Golf was a little bit of a joke. Of course, when you have a GTI Golf and it has 125 horsepower, that's what happens. So Volkswagen went back to the drawing board and decided to create the R32, which is essentially an Audi TT with the body of a Golf on it. 3.2 litre Quattro V6 engine, which was a thing they were pushing at the time, of course, all-wheel drive. And yeah, then you get the Golf R32, a car I'm not a huge fan of. Then again, that might just boil down to the fact I really don't care for the Mark IV Golf at all. As far as this goes to drive, well, simply put, it drives very, very similar to the Ford Escort Cosworth. A little bit of understeer, a fair bit of understeer actually, but a pretty decent car nonetheless. It handles its power relatively well. Yeah, I would much rather drive this over a GTI Golf of the same sort of time period, but even still, there are better cars than this. The later Golf Rs are better than this, and hell, something like a Ford Focus RS or something handles a little bit better in my book. Next up, we have the 2007 Honda Civic Type R, 198 horsepower, 142 foot-pound torque, 2,965 pounds of weight. This is what everyone likes to call the Spaceship Civic, one of my personal favourites of the Honda Civic line. Of course, the Honda Civic going back to 1970. I believe we are on the 10th generation of Honda Civic right now. This is a European 8th gen, which differs from the Japanese 8th gen, which was sort of more of a saloon style body, and of course America got a similar thing. We in Europe would get that, but as the Civic Hybrid, so our Type R would be based on the hatchback, and the hatchback is this spaceship looking one, with a cool ass interior, a really cool, nice, revolutionary design on the front. Interestingly enough, the Type R actually looks slightly less crazy than the normal Civic, when that used to have sort of an entire light bar running across the front end. They'd changed that in a later facelift to make this car look slightly more conventional, but the interior would always remain nice and crazy. And as far as this goes to drive, well, it kind of reminds me of the Civic CRX Mugen I drove right at the start of this episode. It is a fantastic handling car, this one. A little bit slow, it has to be said, 198 horsepower, 142 foot-pound. Not massively special, especially when you consider that the 04 Civic, the Japanese variant that we have in this game, is more powerful and more torquey, but yeah, an absolutely fantastic handling car. I would take one of these out on a racetrack, you know, put some slightly better tyres on it and stuff and see what would happen. I bet it would be a rather good laugh. And finally today, the 2009 Ford Focus RS, 300 horsepower, 318 foot-pounds torque, 3,236 pounds of weight. Perhaps one of my all-time favourite hot hatches. The Focus RS is mental. Basically what it is a Ford Focus with a ridiculous body kit and a 5-cylinder Volvo turbo petrol engine underneath the bonnet, and the Focus ST had this exact same engine, and it was crazy, 240 horsepower. Ford looks at that and goes, how much power do you think we could put through a front-wheel drive before it literally falls to pieces? And you end up with the Focus RS, a 300 horsepower fire-breathing hot hatch monster, a car which is to this day selling for over its retail price with about 50,000 miles on it. These are insanely rare and insanely collectible, and in fact they'd make an even more powerful one, the RS 500 with 350 horsepower. Thankfully we don't have that one in Forza, because otherwise it would probably be quite terrible. This one's surprisingly good. Of course there are some issues getting 300 horsepower through the front wheels, but in general, it actually isn't too bad. The differential behaves itself relatively well. It actually drives quite nicely. Nowhere near as nicely as, of course, the modern Focus RS, which has all-wheel drive and so on and so forth. But for a front-wheel drive car with 300 horsepower, yeah, it does drive surprisingly well. On to the times then, and the Ford Focus RS will be the quickest car today, going into 225th place with 125.984 beat sounds, and Audi RS3 Sportback just, which is very impressive. Quicker than a Mercedes-Benz C32, Lamborghini Miura, just loses out to stuff like the Subaru Impreza and Mitsubishi Lancer, so yeah, quite a good time from that car. Another Ford, 246th place, the Escort RS Cosworth, 127.291, goes in between a John Cooper Works GP Mini Cooper and a Ferrari 250 GT Berlinetta Lusso, quicker than G65, Megane RS 250, an impressive time from an older car. The Volkswagen Golf R32 would go into 261st place for 128.208. Misses out just on the RS Focus from 2003, the car I actually recommended over the R32. Just a little bit better handling, a little bit nicer, but the R32 probably would suit most people's driving styles a little bit more. In 295th place, we find the Honda Civic Type R with a 129.803, goes in between a Firebird Trans Am and a Mustang Mach-1. This is a weird leaderboard, but it is quicker than an Astra VXR from 06 and the Civic Type R from 97, which is interesting because they have similar power figures, but the 07 actually weighs a lot more. In 332nd place, we find the Honda Civic CRX Mugen with 132.029, just quicker than a Vauxhall Corsa VXR, which makes me incredibly happy. A little bit quicker than a Lancia Fulvia, which is actually a relatively close competitor, a little bit slower than a Volvo 850R, but a very good time from that car considering. 341st place would go to the Renault Clio Williams with 133.083, goes in between a Chevrolet Colorado and a Mercedes-Benz 300 SEL. It's quicker than an E-Type, quicker than a 91 Civic, quicker than a 98 Golf. So a decent time considering that car didn't handle particularly well. In 377th place we find the Volkswagen Scirocco 16 valve with 138.625, goes in between a Land Rover Defender and a Mazda Cosmo. A little bit quicker than a Dodge Ram Power Wagon, Volvo 1800C, a Chevrolet Vega, Not a particularly impressive car though, it has to be said. And finally today, the slowest car, perhaps unsurprisingly, is the oldest. 392nd place will go to the Volkswagen Golf GTI with a 142.318. Goes in between a Fiat 8-valve Supersonic and a BMW 328. It's a bit quicker than a Hilux, a Grand Wagoneer, a Honda S800, but of course, that car was never really going to perform particularly well. But all these cars did reasonably well, considering front-wheel drive isn't really the preferred drivetrain for a track like this, and most of these are front-wheel drive. Even the four-wheel drive ones, yeah, they did pretty darn well, and it's always fun for me to drive some hot hatches. It is probably my favourite vehicle class to throw around in the game, one that I do enjoy quite a lot. Anyways, thank you all very much for watching this edition of Forza Top Gear Laps. Do hope you've enjoyed. As always, join us for the Rivals episode on the weekend, where I'm going to be taking a look at 2 rally car superstars, and join us next week when we are going to be taking a look at some more modern hot hatches. So join me for that. Until then, a farewell.